Hello, my name is Greg Jackson. I serve as the Executive Director of the Community Justice Action Fund, but I'm also here in this filibuster for gun safety as a survivor of gun violence. Unfortunately, gun violence has been a real part of my life since a young child. In elementary school, I played on an AAU team sponsored by Sloan's Restaurant in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'll never forget, we lost the championship game, and our starting point guard was devastated and in tears. And I think we were maybe second or third grade, and our entire team rallied around him and cheered him up because he wanted to win so bad, so bad. And the next year, that whole year after the tournament, we were practicing. Everyone was just trying to get it going, doing all we could to become better, because we never wanted to have that feeling of losing again, until our team met up again and we had lost already. You know, that same young man who was so torn about losing that game had lost his life to gun violence in New York that year. And that was my first scrape with gun violence as an elementary child. The second time was actually in high school. Just like anybody, young 15-year-old, you want to go to a New Year's party. We went to a party, it was fun, no drinking involved that we knew of, but I wasn't drinking. And the party ended early because a fight broke out. And I remember we were leaving as the fight happened, and so bummed. And then we heard gunshots and looked up and we saw a young man on the ground who had been shot. That was my second close encounter with gun violence. The third time was when I was in college. I went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia as well, and I was visiting my cousin in Blacksburg, Virginia, near Virginia Tech. And we were going to a good old, local town bar. Everyone was having a good time. And as we were leaving, again, we heard shots ring out. And fortunately, no one was hit. But another moment where a fun time turned into a moment of havoc. The last time I was impacted by gun violence was my cousins had come into town here in Washington, D.C., and we had come together for a bachelor party. We had a great time. We had a nice Moroccan dinner. Half the group was 18, so we had to keep everything pretty PG. But we went to an 18 and up club and partied there. And when we were leaving, we couldn't get a taxi. And because every taxi that passed us, I guess they saw 6 black men and decided we weren't the right customers they wanted. So after the 5th taxi passed us, we decided to walk home. And it was about a 1.5 mile walk late at night. And as we were walking home, of course, we try to be safe, try to be cautious, but just most importantly, just tried to stick together and just be as efficient as possible. And as we were walking home, we literally took the wrong turn. And 2 men were in an altercation. And when they saw us, they thought that maybe we were backup or part of the altercation. I'm not sure exactly what happened. But one panicked and pulled out a gun and started shooting at us. My cousins that I had grown up with since a young child, and me being the oldest cousin of that moment and being the responsible one, I was extremely terrified. Not for my life, but for them and for what it could do to my family if something happened to them. And so, like anyone, we ran, and you just heard multiple bullet shots. And then I felt this real sharp, like lightning bolt up the right side of my leg. And the whole right side of my body just went numb. And that's where I knew I had been shot. But bullets kept ringing, so I couldn't stop. Didn't have a chance to react. I just had to keep going. And I went from running to hobbling to hopping to crawling to dragging myself. And I dragged myself around a column, only about half a block away from where the shooter was. And the first feeling I had was just pure terror, thinking that one of my little cousins could have been harmed, and I could have potentially put them in harm's way. And it felt like the longest time ever because I couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, just didn't know what had happened to them. Excuse me. And luckily I heard one of them yelling, Neil, Neil, Neil. And that's my middle name. And it was my cousin Corey. And so he had come running back to get me. And as I heard him coming back, at first there was a sigh of relief knowing he's okay, but then also another strike of fear, wondering if the shooter was going to come around the corner and finish me off and maybe kill him. And so as much as I wanted to respond, I stayed silent because I was hoping he wouldn't find me. He did find me, and I saw him coming, and that's when I started to actually think about my own well-being. And I looked down and just saw a large pool of blood surrounding me. And I also started to get really lightheaded, and I realized that this was, while I was shot in the leg, this was much more dangerous than I thought. And so as I was getting lightheaded and kind of feeling like I was fading, I remember that feeling of just having this like unfinished business of not knowing, or knowing that I had not done enough with my life to walk away. And being a God-fearing man, that fear of meeting God and meeting Jesus and not being able to look him in the eyes and say I did my part, you know. So I was going through those emotions. Luckily, my cousin got to me fast enough. He saw the blood and jumped into action. He tore off a shirt, which was my shirt, my favorite shirt that he borrowed from my closet, and tied a tourniquet to hold back the blood. And I'm still panicking. Where's everyone else at? Where are the rest of my cousins? And thankfully, they all arrived, and I was the only one shot. And so that's when I was able to really tune into my own pain. And so we called 911. First, a fire truck showed up. I don't know what they could do. Second, police officers came and looked at it and said, oh, it's a leg wound. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it, and kind of brushed it off. And then last, ambulance came. And the ambulance would only allow one of us to ride in the ambulance. And so I had to leave my cousins out there, which was another terrifying moment of leaving them in a city where they knew no one, without a way home. But again, I had to think for myself. And so one cousin came with me, and when I got into the ambulance, that's when all the pain and the adrenaline faded, and all the real pain struck. When I arrived at the hospital, surprisingly, as bad as it was, as bad as it felt, I wasn't met with surgeons or nurses or doctors. I was met with investigators, and I had to go through 3 rounds of investigation before I could see any healthcare professional. And I'll never forget being questioned as if I was part of the problem. You know, what were you doing there? Would you stash the gun? Did you have drugs? Were you buying drugs? Who did you know there? And I was infuriated because while I'm in and out of consciousness, I'm trying to defend my innocence to law enforcement in the emergency room. And so eventually I said, I'm not answering any more questions. I got extremely angry and they backed off. And I guess they deemed me non-compliant or whatever. And then my doctor rushed over, quickly assessed the wound, and realized the bullet had hit 2 arteries and that I was bleeding to death. And I only had about 26 minutes left to live. He also shared that he would do his best, but there's a good chance I wouldn't make it due to the blood loss and the damage that's been done. And if I do make it, there's a very good chance they'll have to amputate. Am I okay with that? So I went from having one of the greatest nights of my family to trying to figure out if it's okay for a doctor to potentially save my life, and more than likely have to amputate. So I went through surgery. I'll never forget coming out of surgery. Thankfully, I was not amputated. I survived. But I arrived in my hospital room alone. And I was confused. Where are my family? Where are my friends? Where's everyone? And no one was there. And something was off. And so in and out of consciousness through meds. A few hours later, I asked the nurse, where's my family? Where's everyone? And they said, oh, well, we can't tell them where you are because we don't want the person to come harm you. And I said, well, what about my family? My mom, everyone, like they need to know where I am. And so I had to sign this paperwork to be released, or my location to be released. And I found that my family did not know where I was for hours at that point. They had no clue if I was alive or dead, what hospital I was at, and they were in sheer panic, driving from hours all over the country to be there for me. So luckily they got there, everyone was there, and they were able to support me. But then the real journey began because I went through 6 months of recovery, 6 surgeries, 21 days in and out the hospital. I nearly lost my job, but was thankfully able to take kind of a leave of absence. But I was bedridden for about 3.5 of those 6 months. And that's all from one bullet. That's from one bullet. And the story I'm telling you is actually one of the positive ones. I'm one of the lucky ones. You know, in America, every year, over 100,000 people are shot or killed by guns. And when you look at the black community specifically, and homicide specifically, we make up over 80% of those who are killed by homicide. And this is now the #1 cause of premature death for all youth, the #1 cause of premature death for black men, and the #2 cause of premature death for black women and Latino men. And so when I was in my recovery, I spent time really researching and digging deeper into what this issue is, how it's impacting us, and what that means for me and others like me, and what can be done. And I was able to learn a lot about this crisis, but also the solutions. When I was shot, I was actually shot 4 days after the Senate failed to pass a background check vote. And I'll never forget going through that recovery and watching members of Congress very thoroughly, by the way, because I was bedridden, watching their arguments, watching their reasonings, their fights against this. It's about the Second Amendment. What about our rights? What about our families? What about our communities? What about my district? This is not happening in my neighborhood. This is not an issue for us or my constituents. And feeling completely enthralled with anger at how careless they were and how little urgency they had about a crisis that was taking so many lives in our community. I was shot in 2013. And so since I was shot, nearly 1 million people have been directly impacted by gun violence. That means they have been shot or killed since that moment. And while that may sound like a very big number, for me, unfortunately, that also includes people I've known and loved and cared about. I'll give you 2 examples. One, Karan Brown in Washington, D.C. He was a young man at Stanton Elementary School who was passionate about sports, passionate about reading, enjoyed chess, great, vibrant young man, but also very ambitious, really cared about making money. And so for the summer, he wanted to sell water bottles because that was a nice little hustle for someone in elementary school. So he sold water bottles during the hot summer on the corner. And little Karan got in a dispute with another kid. The other kid got angry, went back and told his stepfather or his mom's boyfriend, and that grown man came back and shot and killed Karan Brown on the corner. Karan had just held his own Stop the Violence, Stop Gun Violence rally 3 weeks before he was shot and killed. And that's one of the lives that have been lost since the Senate failed to take action. One more example, Trey. Trey was someone who was best friends with my cousin Tyler, my cousin who was with me when I was shot, who rode in the ambulance with me to the hospital. And at a party in Greensboro, North Carolina, he caught a stray bullet to the chest and took his last breaths literally in my cousin Tyler's arms and bled to death. These are the people who we're losing while we refuse to take action. And these are more than numbers. These are more than memorials. These are more than figures and facts. These are real lives and real individuals who have been traumatized across our community and across our country. And it continues. Less than a month ago, we had a terrible shooting in Buffalo, New York. And I went there that Monday following the shooting. And I'll never forget being in that community. And the first thing I realized was, wow, this is a very small neighborhood and a very tight neighborhood. For folks who don't know about where the shooting happened, there are 90,000 African Americans in the city of Buffalo, about 94,000. 80% of them are concentrated in East Buffalo. And there's only a handful of neighborhoods that make up that population. This shooting happened in the heart of East Buffalo. And when I went out there, as soon as I touched down, the second, third, fourth person I met, all of them were related to someone who was shot and killed neighbors with someone who was shot and killed, went to church with someone who was shot and killed, were friends with someone who was shot and killed. And you saw very quickly that this wasn't just 10 lives lost. This was an entire community that had been traumatized. While I was there, I had to pick up a U-Haul to help deliver some food and essential products to folks who didn't have access to that due to the supermarket being shut down. And I remember going to the U-Haul site and seeing this man standing outside, kind of looking off into the distance, disturbed. And I went over and just checked, like, hey, man, you doing all right? And I realized he was looking at a church, and there was a huge commotion at a church. And it was a funeral for Hayward Patterson. And this young man was the nephew of Hayward Patterson. And we had talked for 30 minutes about what this meant and how this happened. And I'll never forget that he was so distraught and still in shock by what had happened. He couldn't stay in the funeral home. He couldn't believe that his uncle's life had been stolen from him. And he couldn't believe that someone who was so integral to his family, so full of life, so exciting, so inspiring to him personally, had been stolen because of gun violence and hate. He also had 8 children. So Hayward's nephew had 8 children who he did not take to the funeral because he didn't want to re-traumatize them for that loss. And when I looked over across the street, you saw hundreds of people leaving that funeral, and I couldn't help to think how many generations and communities and individuals have been impacted by this ripple of violence and trauma and pain from that violent act. When we had the first big vigil that week, there was a young woman who was bawling in tears at the vigil, and she had a little girl with her. And I remember she was so upset, and all I could do was just wrap my arms around her and just console her. And she had a little child with her who was too young to process what was going on and was playing with flowers and goofing off and running around. And it was the cutest thing ever. I gave her a high five, tried to keep her entertained. At the end of the event, I asked her, are you okay? Is everything all right? What can I do for you? And she said, I knew Roberta. We knew Roberta. Roberta Drury was the 32-year-old that was shot and killed. And this was someone who was very close friends with Roberta. And that young child, Roberta had cared for. And this young child had no clue, was too young to even process the loss of someone she loved. But to watch those 2 individuals go through that trauma as well. And these were just 2 stories of dozens of stories of individuals throughout the community. One young man that helped me do some maintenance work on a refrigerator, it's a long story there, was a drummer and drummed alongside the security guard that was lost from that moment. I met one man, Nigel, who was cousins to 2 of those folks who were shot and killed. And so when we think about what happens in communities, it's not just the individuals that are shot or injured, it's about the entire community that's impacted and traumatized by that moment. And that trauma spreads, it festers, and it leads to more danger and frankly more issues within our communities. So when we look at this 100,000 per year, it's probably better to think about the 400 or 600 or 800,000 people who have been directly impacted by violence every single year. But I say all that to say that this crisis is, in my opinion, the largest public health crisis of our time. And what we need in this moment is not a crime control response. It's not just a law and order response. What we need for this public health crisis is a public health response, just like we did with COVID-19, just like we did with the opioid crisis. That's what we need to see to address violence in our community. So when we say a public health response, there's really 3 major areas that we're fighting for change in. One is for real investment and resources into intervention programs that intervene conflicts, that support survivors as they're traumatized with hopes of reducing their likelihood of retaliating, but also works with the neighbors, the community, and those closest to that victim to ensure that they are healing and navigating through their trauma in as healthy a way as possible. The same way we think about opioids and COVID, the first step was helping and healing and providing for those directly impacted. And gun violence is no different. Last year, President Biden put $5 billion in his Build Back Better Act for community violence intervention and prevention services and strategies to do just that, to focus on those who have been most impacted by violence and provide resources to strengthen those programs all over the country. Some of these programs have proven to reduce violence upwards of 60% in less than 5 years. But yet, there's only, prior to the Biden administration, only $16 million had been invested federally into these proactive solutions to reduce violence. The Build Back Better Act has not been voted on in the Senate. It's still pending. So we knew that we needed to take an additional action. And so Senator Booker and Congressman Steve Horsford introduced the Break the Cycle of Violence Act that echoed that same need, and had the request for $5 billion for violence intervention and prevention strategies, but also $1.5 billion in strategic, targeted workforce programs for communities that have been suffering the most from violence and poverty. This transformational bill would provide resources that could dramatically change the outcome or dramatically change violence in communities in the top 48 cities most impacted by violence. So that's huge. The other thing that we're asking for when we say a public health response is we're saying that we need funding and resources to address the risk factors that lead to violence. And some of those risk factors include the access to firearms by those who mean to bring harm or are most vulnerable to violence. And so that's why we've been fighting for the Prevent Trafficking Act, sponsored by Representative Robin Kelly, that we know can work upstream to hold the traffickers, the gun dealers, the gun suppliers accountable for the crimes that they're doing or the predatory actions that they're doing by putting guns in the hands of those who mean to do harm or pouring them into communities, frankly, that are most vulnerable to violence. The other big thing that we're fighting for is efforts to address the root causes of violence. And that means we have to take a whole of government approach to address violence in communities, which means proactively looking at housing, instability, economic opportunity, educational inequality, and everything that we know leads to the risk factors that lead to violence. The communities that are most impacted by violence are not the least policed. They're not the least incarcerated. In fact, in most communities, in most states and cities, the most incarcerated communities are the ones who are also suffering the most from violence. But they are the communities that are suffering most from economic inopportunity, education inequality, housing instability, et cetera. And so it's important that we focus on that three-pronged approach for a public health approach to ending gun violence. It's not as simple as banning guns. It's not as simple as permitting strategies. It needs to focus on those most impacted, reducing the risk factors, and then also starting to address the root causes while we look at the long-term strategies to keep more guns out of our communities. And so I stand before you urging and demanding that the U.S. Senate pass the bipartisan framework to end gun violence, understanding that it includes vital resources to intervene violence and conflict, that it focuses on the risk factors that lead to violence, including loopholes in the background check process and trafficking measures to prevent trafficking, but also because we know that this bill is the first real stride towards ending gun violence has been taken in 29 years. So there are still a lot of details to be seen. A lot of the written text has to be ironed out, and amendments and debate will happen. But what's most important in this moment is that we take action, because it's more urgent than ever. And I'm here to ask for that change, recognizing that there are people like me all over this country that have never had the opportunity to speak for change. And unfortunately, if we don't take action, there will be thousands of young boys and young men and young women like me who will never have the opportunity to fight for change in the future. So thank you so much, and God be with everyone who's advocating for change.